Hello guys, and welcome to a build of a kit which I've been looking forward to for a long time now. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name of this aircraft, and I won't be showing you any reference images either because this is a what-if aircraft. This was an aircraft which was being developed by Nazi Germany towards the end of World War II, but it did only reach the drawing board or perhaps the scale model wind tunnel testing phase before the war was over. As you can see, it's a really unusual design with these three rotating arms which would provide thrust, and as soon as I saw this kit I knew I had to have one. The other strange thing about it is that it's in 1/35th scale, which is an unusual scale for aircraft, but it does mean that it goes well with armour models. Miniart have released a few different versions of this with some slightly subtle changes. This is the night fighter version. You can see here on the nose we have the antennae there for locating aircraft at night. There are various different versions as well that Miniart have released. The box includes 4 suggested paint schemes, but of course this wasn't a real aircraft and so these schemes are fictitious, and really it is a blank canvas for your imagination when it comes to painting. So if we look inside the box, it's a fairly small kit. We have this sprue which contains the 2 cockpit halves. We have 3 sprues like this which contain the arms or the rotors. A sprue containing cockpit detail. And then a sprue containing the 2 halves of the tail. There are of course some clear parts as well, which I'll show you later, and there's a small fret of photo etch parts as well. The instructions are standard Miniart instructions. They're pretty easy to follow. And I would say, if you've only ever built an older Miniart kit, the first ones that I built were those vacuum formed ruined building kits they have, I would strongly encourage you to try one of their modern kits. They're really good. The instructions are nice and clear, the moulding is very high quality, the fit is excellent. So if you've only ever tried old Miniart kits, maybe give them another chance because they've improved significantly in recent years. As with most aircraft kits, the construction starts with the cockpit. This goes together nicely. I did step away from the instruction sequence slightly in that I didn't put the seat in at the moment. I wanted the seat to be a different colour and therefore I put all of the other components in the cockpit which will be painted RLM 66. And you can see here as the cockpit starts to build up, there's a little bit of detail here on the outside. This will form the gun bays, and you can either cover those with panels or leave them open. There's also a tiny amount of photo etch for some levers there on the left hand side of the control panel. And here are those guns, and you can see how they would fit in. The instructions would have you fit them in early on before painting, but again I decided to step away from that sequence and leave them until later so that I could actually paint and weather the gun bays nicely. And you can see here how that builds up and how the outer side of the cockpit goes on, revealing those gun bays. The middle section to which the wings or the rotors will attach is a very simple affair. And the rotors themselves have a small amount of detail inside them, and of course the nature of that will mean that you need to paint inside there before you put the 2 halves of the rotors together. There are 3 legs with wheels at the end which form the landing gear. The instructions indicate that you should attach these to the tail during the construction process, but there's no reason you can't leave them off until the end because you can just slide them into the gaps. And of course that will make painting easier. The 2 tail halves went together very nicely with only minimal sanding needed. And I feel like this has been a very quick part of the video, but the build itself was pretty straightforward. I did most of this in a single day. The one thing I do notice now when I put those rotors in there is just how big this kit is. Not in terms of height, but certainly in terms of wingspan. And here is the cockpit painted in the recommended RLM 66 colour. In this case I used Tamiya XF63 German Grey. I applied a little bit of chipping with a fine brush in a silver colour and then a AK streaking grime wash. And then for the gun base, to break up the colour a bit, I used RLM02 from Vallejo Model Air. The decals for the instrument panel are very nice. Although this looks like one big decal, you can just cut it out into smaller individual ones and apply them manually. There are also a couple of spare decals in case you mess up. So in terms of colour schemes, I spent a long time thinking about how to paint this. The kit includes these 4 schemes here, but of course, as I said before, they're fictional, so I could really use any scheme I wanted. I do like the black and red splinter camo scheme here in the top right. That's almost like a red primer kind of colour. And I also looked at some of the instructions for the other versions of the kit. This Africa scheme in the top left is quite interesting as well. And in the Interceptor version of the kit here we have a few sort of standard German schemes applied to this kit. I'm not quite as tempted by those as others because I want this to stand out a little bit more. This splinter scheme here was quite interesting. It's quite reminiscent of the scheme used on the V2 rockets. And I also considered painting it in one of the captured schemes. So a Russian version here, an American Air Force version, or possibly an RAF version. But in the end, the one that jumped out at me was this scheme here. It might look a little bit mundane, it's only 3 colours, but I like the checkered black and white pattern there. It reminds me a bit of the test scheme for the V2 rockets. And that kind of fits in with how I want to put this in a little diorama. I don't want this to be a majorly futuristic theme or feel. I want it to be just perhaps slightly further ahead than the actual aircraft was. So perhaps there is a prototype that has been built, but it's not in regular use. So this is the scheme which I decided to go for. I gave everything a coat of XF69 to act as a base layer, and then did a bit more sanding on top of that because there were still a few issues. And to achieve that, I first of all painted the white areas. Unfortunately, I don't have any flat white at the moment. It seems to be in quite short supply, so we had to go for a gloss white there. And then I painted the remaining areas in XF58 olive green. To paint the black and white squares, there's no other way to do it except to mask alternate rows. So here, for example, you can see that I'm masking the squares nearest the tail. Once they're painted, I'll take the masking off and I'll remask further up to paint the next row of squares. Obviously the body of this aircraft is curved, so the squares won't be strictly square. To help me in this process, I used the rows of rivets to be the edge of the shapes. This process was a bit more difficult on the cockpit because the curve is more significant, and the only way I could have really solved that problem was to have different height of squares going around the cockpit, but once it's built I don't think that's super obvious. The decals went down well, and I added some fine chipping around the gun bay panels with a bit of metallic paint. I masked off the rear of the thrusters and painted them with X11 chrome, and then at the edge of those I gave a very light coat of a highly thinned brown colour and some highly thinned clear blue as well to give a sort of heat discoloration effect. Putting the landing gear in place was quite straightforward. There's one central wheel and the 4 corner wheels. And while the glue was drying on those, I stood the aircraft up to make sure everything was straight and level. I used Tamiya black panel liner to highlight the rivets and the panel lines, of which there are a lot on this kit. With these rivets you can't really avoid getting excess product on the model itself, so once that was slightly dry I removed it with a damp cotton bud using some enamel thinners. And I did exactly the same thing on the rivets which go across the body. It looks quite messy here, but it's easily cleaned up using the method I described. Finally, I wanted to add some oil and grease stains to the rotating part of the aircraft. I did this with some of my Abteilung 502 oil paints. It was quite hard to film this because of the dark colours on the aircraft, but essentially I put some dots of oil paint and blended them in with some thinners. And with that done, the final steps were to mask and paint the clear parts. There are only 3 of them and they're very simple to apply. And before they were attached, the whole model was given a coat of TS80 flat. And before I show you the pictures of the final model, let me take a moment to say thank you for watching, and a special thanks to my Patreon supporters. If you do want to support the channel, there is a link in the description. And of course, I'm extremely grateful to everyone who has signed up via Patreon so far. Your support is greatly appreciated, and of course anything I make through Patreon goes back into buying things for the channel, so thank you very much guys for your support. Okay, and here is the final model. So guys, I hope you enjoyed that build. It was great fun building this what if kit. I particularly like the freedom it gives you in terms of the colour schemes, and it was a fairly easy kit to build as well, a fairly low parts count, and it's definitely going to stand out on the shelf. Because this is a 1/35th scale kit, I'm very tempted to add this to a small diorama, and I have a little idea of what might go with that in the new year. I have managed to make some good progress on some existing projects recently, including the zombie diorama, which you've already seen the first 2 parts for. So hopefully that and a few more projects will be finished in the next couple of weeks, and I'll be able to have a clean desk for starting 2021. So guys, until the next video, thank you very much for watching. If you liked this, then please consider liking and subscribing. Have a happy new year, and I hope to see you in the next video.